The old piano keys felt like silk beneath Isabella Morrison's fingertips as she played the final notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. The melody drifted through the empty classroom, ethereal and haunting in the lamplight that cast long shadows across the worn wooden floors. It was nearly midnight, and Harborview Elementary School stood silent as a cathedral, save for the music that poured from her soul. She hadn't meant to stay so late. The lesson with little Emma Chen had run over when the child struggled with a particularly difficult passage, her small fingers stumbling over keys that seemed too far apart for her reach. But Emma's determination reminded Isabella of herself at that age, desperate to master something beautiful in a world that offered so little beauty. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Isabella's hands froze above the keys, her heart hammering against her ribs. She held her breath, listening. Nothing but the tick of the old clock and the distant sound of wind rattling the windows. She was being foolish. The building settled at night, that was all. She lowered the piano lid with careful precision, wincing at the soft thud that seemed to echo through the classroom like a gunshot. Gathering her sheet music and shawl, she moved toward the door, her footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. "Miss Morrison," the deep voice from the doorway stopped her cold. She spun around, the sheet music scattering to the floor like autumn leaves, to find a tall figure silhouetted against the pale light from the hallway. Her breath caught in her throat as Alexander Sterling stepped into the room, his presence filling the space with an authority that made the very air seem to vibrate. "Mr. Sterling," her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. I, I was just playing piano in my school after hours." His voice was low, controlled, but she could hear the steel beneath the silk. "Without permission." The new headmaster was nothing like the elderly Dr. Campbell who had run the school with gentle wisdom for 30 years. Alexander Sterling was young, perhaps 32, with dark hair that caught the lamplight and eyes the color of storm clouds. He carried himself with the bearing of a man accustomed to command, his shoulders broad beneath his perfectly tailored coat. Isabella lifted her chin, trying to summon the courage that had carried her through 3 years of teaching. The children were having difficulty with their music lessons. "I thought additional instruction might—" "The children." He stepped closer and she caught the scent of his cologne, something expensive and masculine that made her pulse quicken despite her fear. "At midnight, Miss Morrison." Heat flooded her cheeks. She couldn't tell him about Emma, about the extra money she desperately needed to pay for her mother's medicine. The school board had strict policies about private tutoring, and she couldn't afford to lose her position. "I was practicing," she said finally, "for Sunday service at the church." It wasn't entirely a lie. She did play for the small congregation at St. Mary's, though Father Mills paid her only a few coins for her efforts. Alexander's eyes narrowed, and she had the unsettling feeling that he could see straight through her fabrication. He moved to where her sheet music lay scattered and bent to retrieve the pages, his movements fluid and precise. When he straightened, he glanced at the music in his hands. "Chopin," he said quietly, "Nocturne in E-flat major." Isabella blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected a school administrator to recognize classical compositions. "You know music." Something flickered across his features. Pain, perhaps, or regret. "I know many things, Miss Morrison, including the sound of exceptional talent when I hear it." The unexpected compliment made her stomach flutter, but she forced herself to remain composed. "Thank you, but I really should be going. My mother will be worried." "Your mother is ill." It wasn't a question. Isabella's hands tightened on her shawl. "How did you—" "Dr. Wright mentioned it when he submitted the medical bills to the school insurance fund." Alexander's expression softened slightly. "Tuberculosis is a difficult burden for a family to bear." The mention of the bills made Isabella's cheeks burn with shame. The school provided minimal health coverage for employees' families, but her mother's condition required expensive treatments that far exceeded what the fund could cover. She'd been forced to take on additional work wherever she could find it. Washing clothes for wealthy families, mending garments by candlelight, and yes, giving secret piano lessons to children whose parents could afford to pay. "I manage quite well, thank you," she said stiffly. "I'm sure you do." Alexander set the sheet music on the piano bench with careful precision. "However, I cannot allow unauthorized use of school property to continue. The insurance liability alone—" "Please." The word escaped before she could stop it, raw with desperation. "I need this position, Mr. Sterling. I'll do anything." She stopped, horrified by how the words might be interpreted. Alexander's expression grew unreadable. Anything, Miss Morrison. The way he said it, soft and dangerous, made her pulse race. She took a step backward, suddenly aware of how alone they were in the shadowed classroom. I meant, I meant that I would follow any rules you set. I won't use the piano after hours again. He studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes seeming to catalog every detail of her face. Finally, he nodded. See that you don't. And Miss Morrison, yes. Next time you wish to practice, ask permission first. I might be more accommodating than you expect. With that cryptic statement, he turned and walked from the room, leaving Isabella alone with her racing heart and the lingering scent of his cologne. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, matching Isabella's mood as she prepared for another day of teaching. She'd barely slept, her mind replaying every moment of her encounter with Alexander Sterling. The way he'd looked at her, the unexpected knowledge of music he'd displayed, the strange gentleness in his voice when he'd mentioned her mother's illness, it all swirled together in a confusing tangle of emotions she couldn't untangle. She dressed carefully in her best navy wool dress, pinning her auburn hair into a severe bun that she hoped conveyed professional competence. The mirror reflected back tired green eyes and pale cheeks, but there was nothing to be done about that. She had work to do and children to teach, regardless of her personal turmoil. The walk to school took her through the heart of Harborview's working-class neighborhood, past tenement buildings that housed the families of dock workers, seamstresses, and factory laborers. Children ran through the narrow streets, their voices echoing off brick walls as they played games of tag and hopscotch. It was these children she taught, bright, eager minds, trapped in circumstances beyond their control. Harborview Elementary stood like a beacon of hope among the crowded buildings, its red brick facade and tall windows promising education and opportunity to those who might otherwise have none. Isabella had attended this school herself as a child, sitting in the very classrooms where she now taught. The continuity gave her comfort, a sense of belonging that helped ease the ache of missing her father, who had died when she was 16. Good morning, Miss Morrison. Emma Chen's clear voice cut through Isabella's melancholy. The young girl ran up the school steps. At 8 years old, Emma was small for her age, with delicate features and intelligent, dark eyes that seemed to see everything. Her family had immigrated from China 5 years ago, and her father worked at the docks, loading and unloading ships for barely enough wages to keep food on their table. Good morning, Emma, Isabella replied, her heart warming at the child's enthusiasm. Are you ready for your arithmetic lesson today? Emma's face fell slightly. Yes, Miss Morrison, but she lowered her voice to a whisper. Could we perhaps have a music lesson later? I've been practicing the scales you taught me, but I'm having trouble with the fingering on the third octave. Isabella's chest tightened. The child had such natural talent, such pure love for music, but any formal training was impossible given her family's circumstances. The few coins Isabella charged for lessons were barely enough to cover the cost of sheet music, let alone a proper piano for Emma to practice on. We'll see what we can arrange, Isabella said carefully, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. But you must remember, it's our secret, Emma finished with a solemn nod. I understand, Miss Morrison. The school day began with the familiar routine of morning prayers and the Pledge of Allegiance. Isabella's classroom hummed with the energy of 26 children, aged 8 to 10, their voices blending in recitation of multiplication tables and reading assignments. She moved among them with practiced ease, offering encouragement, here gentle correction, there her heart full, despite the worry that gnawed at her. It was during the lunch hour that she noticed him. Alexander Sterling stood in the doorway of her classroom, his presence commanding attention even in silence. He wore a charcoal gray suit that emphasized his lean frame, and his dark hair was perfectly styled despite the humid weather. Several of the children glanced up from their meal of bread and cheese, their eyes wide with curiosity at the imposing figure in their doorway. Mr. Sterling, Isabella said, rising from her desk where she'd been grading papers. Is there something you need? I was observing, he said simply. Your teaching methods are unconventional. Isabella's spine stiffened. She'd been demonstrating fractions using pieces of apple, allowing the children to eat their lesson once they'd mastered the concept. It was messy and loud, but effective. The children grasped mathematical concepts much more readily when they could see and touch the examples. The children learn better with hands-on experience, she said defensively. I wasn't criticizing. Alexander stepped into the room, his presence seeming to fill every corner. In fact, I was impressed by their engagement. In my previous position, I rarely saw students so eager to participate. Isabella blinked in surprise. Your previous position, the Whitmore Academy in Boston, a rather prestigious institution. Something in his tone suggested that prestige hadn't necessarily been a positive quality. Very different from Harborview. What brought you here? The question slipped out before Isabella could stop herself, and she immediately regretted it. It was far too personal, too bold for a teacher to ask her superior. Alexander's expression grew shuttered. Personal reasons, he said curtly. Then, as if realizing how harsh he sounded, he added more gently, I found that I preferred working with children who truly needed education rather than those who saw it as an inconvenience between social engagements. The admission surprised Isabella. She'd assumed he'd come to Harborview because he couldn't find work at a more prestigious school, but his words suggested otherwise. Before she could respond, little Tommy Brennan tugged on her skirt. Miss Morrison, Johnny won't share his apple slices for the fraction lesson. Isabella knelt to the boy's level, smoothing his unruly red hair. Perhaps Johnny has already eaten his apple slices, Tommy. Why don't you use mine instead? She reached for her own apple, cutting it into precise quarters with the small knife she kept for such demonstrations. As she handed the pieces to Tommy, she noticed Alexander watching the interaction with an unreadable expression. You give up your own lunch for them, he observed quietly. Isabella's cheeks warmed. It's just an apple. Is it? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning she couldn't quite grasp. Before she could respond, the school bell rang, signaling the end of lunch period. The children quickly cleaned up their desks and settled into their seats, their attention turning to Isabella expectantly. This afternoon we'll be studying American history, she announced. Can anyone tell me about the Boston Tea Party? Hands shot up around the room, and Isabella smiled as she called on Mary O'Sullivan, a bright girl whose Irish accent still colored her speech despite 3 years in Boston. Please, Miss Morrison, my DOS says the colonists were rebels who destroyed good tea because they didn't want to pay their taxes. Laughter rippled through the classroom, and Isabella noticed that even Alexander's stern expression had softened into something approaching amusement. That's one way to look at it, Mary, Isabella said diplomatically. But perhaps we should examine why the colonists felt their actions were justified. She launched into the lesson, weaving a narrative that brought the historical events to life. She spoke of taxation without representation of ordinary people pushed to their breaking point, of the courage it took to stand up against seemingly insurmountable power. As she talked, she noticed the children leaning forward in their seats, completely absorbed in the story, and Alexander Sterling was listening just as intently. When the lesson ended and the children began filing out for their afternoon recess, Alexander approached her desk. You have a gift, he said simply. Isabella looked up from the paper she was organizing, startled by the compliment. I beg your pardon. For teaching, for reaching children, and making them care about learning. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. It's rarer than you might think. Thank you, Isabella said softly, unsure how to respond to such unexpected praise from a man she'd assumed disapproved of her methods. Alexander was quiet for a moment, his gray eyes studying her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Finally, he said, Miss Morrison, I wonder if you might join me for tea this afternoon. There are some matters regarding the school's music program that I'd like to discuss. Isabella's heart skipped. The music program, Dr. Campbell's records indicate that Harborview hasn't had formal music instruction in over 3 years, despite having a perfectly serviceable piano. Alexander's gaze flicked to the upright piano that had stood silent in the corner of the classroom. I believe that's a disservice to our students. Isabella's mind raced. Was he offering her the opportunity to teach music officially? It seemed too good to be true, especially after their encounter the night before. Yes, I would be very interested in discussing that, she managed. Excellent. Shall we say 4 o'clock? After the children have departed for the day. Isabella nodded, not trusting her as Alexander smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him, and the transformation of his features was startling. Gone was the stern headmaster, replaced by a man who was devastatingly handsome and surprisingly warm. Until this afternoon, then, he said, and left the classroom with that same fluid grace she'd noticed the night before. Isabella sank into her chair, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to process what had just happened. Alexander Sterling was an enigma, harsh and demanding one moment, unexpectedly kind the next. And the way he'd looked at her when he smiled. She shook her head firmly. Such thoughts were dangerous and inappropriate. He was her superior, and she was a woman who couldn't afford to risk her position for foolish, romantic fantasies. Whatever his reasons for wanting to discuss the music program, she would treat it as the professional matter it undoubtedly was. But as she tried to focus on her afternoon lessons, she found her gaze drifting to the clock on the wall, counting the minutes until 4 o'clock arrived. The afternoon passed with agonizing slowness. Isabella found herself distracted during lessons, stumbling over words she'd said hundreds of times before. When young Peter Walsh asked her what 7 times 8 equaled, she automatically replied Chopin before catching herself and providing the correct answer of 56. The children seemed to sense her preoccupation, exchanging glances and giggling softly when they thought she wasn't looking. Even Emma Chen, normally the most focused of her students, spent more time watching Isabella than concentrating on her reading assignment. When the final bell rang at 3:30, Isabella felt a mixture of relief and nervousness that made her stomach flutter like a caged bird. She helped the children gather their belongings and watched them stream out of the classroom in their usual chaos of chatter and laughter. Emma lingered behind as she often did when she hoped for an impromptu music lesson. "Miss Morrison," the child said hesitantly, "will there be time for piano practice today?" Isabella's heart clenched. "I'm afraid not today, dear one. I have a meeting with Mr. Sterling." Emma's eyes widened with concern. "Are you in trouble? Is it because of the music lessons?" "No, sweetheart," Isabella said quickly, kneeling to the child's level. "Mr. Sterling wants to discuss the possibility of adding music to the regular curriculum." "Really?" Emma's face lit up with hope so pure and bright that Isabella felt tears prick her eyes. "Does that mean we could have music lessons for everyone?" "Perhaps," Isabella said carefully, "but you mustn't get your hopes up too high. These things take time to arrange." Emma nodded solemnly, but Isabella could see the excitement dancing in her dark eyes. "I'll practice my scales at home," she promised, "on the table like you showed me." Isabella's throat tightened. The image of Emma practicing finger positions on a wooden table, unable to hear the music she was creating, was almost too painful to bear. Every child deserved the chance to make music, to experience the Barnstonian beauty that could transform even the darkest moments of life. After Emma left, Isabella spent the remaining time until 4 o'clock tidying her classroom and trying to calm her nerves. She changed from her practical teaching dress into her better afternoon gown of deep green wool and unpinned her hair to brush it smooth before securing it in a softer style that framed her face. When the clock chimed 4, she made her way to Alexander's office, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. She paused outside his door, taking a deep breath to steady herself before knocking. "Come in." Alexander's voice was warm, less formal than she'd expected. She pushed open the door to find him standing beside a small table set with delicate china tea service. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting golden highlights in his dark hair and softening the harsh lines of his face. "Miss Morrison," he said, moving to pull out a chair for her. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Isabella settled into the offered seat, acutely aware of his proximity as he pushed her chair closer to the table. The scent of his cologne mingled with the aroma of Earl Grey tea, creating an unexpectedly intimate atmosphere. "You mentioned the music program," she said, accepting the delicate teacup he offered her. "Yes." Alexander took the seat across from her, his long fingers wrapped around his own cup. "I've been reviewing Dr. Campbell's records, and I was surprised to discover that music instruction was discontinued due to budget constraints. However, a thorough examination of our current finances suggests that we might be able to reinstate the program." Isabella's pulse quickened. "That would be wonderful for the children. Many of them have never had the opportunity to experience music education." "Precisely what I was thinking." Alexander's gray eyes met hers over the rim of his teacup. "The question is whether we have qualified instructors available." Isabella set down her cup, carefully trying to keep her hands steady. I do have some musical training, though I'm certainly not a professional musician." "Don't you?" Alexander's voice was soft, thoughtful. "Last night when I heard you playing Chopin, it sounded quite professional to me." Heat flooded Isabella's cheeks. "You were listening." "I was drawn by the music," he admitted, I came to investigate what I assumed was an intruder only to discover—" He paused, his gaze growing distant. It had been a very long time since I had heard music played with such feeling. Something in his tone made Isabella study his face more carefully. "You mentioned that you know music. Do you play—" Alexander's expression shuddered, the warmth in his eyes replaced by something cooler and more guarded. "I did, once." "What instrument?" For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then quietly he said, "Piano. I studied at the Vienna Conservatory for 2 years." Isabella's eyes widened. The Vienna Conservatory was one of the most prestigious music schools in the world. Only the most talented and wealthy students were accepted. "That's incredible. Why did you stop?" "Family obligations," Alexander said curtly, in a tone that suggested the subject was closed. But Isabella had heard the pain beneath the words and her heart ached for him. She knew what it was like to sacrifice musical dreams for practical necessities. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Alexander looked up, surprised by the sympathy in her voice. For a moment their eyes met and held, and Isabella felt something shift between them. A recognition of shared loss, perhaps, or simply the understanding that comes when two wounded souls recognize each other. "Tell me about your training," Alexander said finally, his voice gentler now. Isabella hesitated. Her musical education had been informal, cobbled together from church organists and a few precious lessons with the town's former piano teacher before the woman had moved away. But there had also been hours upon hours of practice driven by a passion that consumed her completely. "My father taught me the basics when I was very young," she said carefully. "He played by ear mostly, but he had a natural gift for melody. After he died, I taught myself mostly from books and sheet music I could borrow." "And yet you play Chopin as if you'd studied with masters," Alexander observed. Isabella's cheeks warmed at the compliment. "Music has always been my escape. When my mother fell ill, when money was tight, when life seemed overwhelming, I could lose myself at the piano and find peace." Alexander nodded slowly, understanding, flickering in his gray eyes. "Music has a way of healing the soul when nothing else can reach it." The quiet intimacy of his words sent a shiver through Isabella. She had the strange feeling that he understood her in a way few people ever had, that he could see past her careful composure to the passionate, dreaming woman she kept hidden beneath her practical exterior. "Mr. Sterling," she began, then stopped, unsure how to voice what she was thinking. "Alexander," he said quietly, "when we're alone like this, please call me Alexander." The request sent her pulse racing. "Alexander," she repeated, savoring the feel of his name on her tongue. "What exactly are you proposing regarding the music program?" Alexander leaned forward slightly, his expression growing animated in a way she hadn't seen before. "I'd like to establish regular music instruction for all students, beginning with basic theory and progressing to practical application. Those students who show particular aptitude could receive additional training." Isabella's heart soared at the possibilities. "That sounds wonderful, but surely such a program would require a qualified music teacher." "It would," Alexander agreed. "Someone with both musical talent and teaching ability. Someone who understands this children and what music could mean to them." Isabella stared at him, hardly daring to hope. "Are you offering me the position?" "I'm suggesting that you consider it," Alexander said carefully. "It would require additional training, additional responsibilities. And there would be complications." "What sort of complications?" Alexander was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing the rim of his teacup. When he looked up, there was something unreadable in his expression. "The school board can be conservative in their thinking. They might question whether a young, unmarried woman should hold such a prominent position within the school." Isabella's hope deflated slightly. She'd faced such prejudices before, seeing the assumption that unmarried women were somehow less reliable, less committed to their duties. It was one of the reasons she'd never seriously considered leaving Harborview, despite the limited opportunities it offered. "I see," she said quietly. "However," Alexander continued, "I believe I can make a convincing argument for your appointment, provided you're interested in accepting the challenge." Isabella looked into his gray eyes, seeing something there that made her pulse quicken. There was professional respect, certainly, but something else as well, something warmer and more personal that she didn't dare name. "I would be very interested," she said softly. Alexander smiled, and once again Isabella was struck by how the expression transformed his face. Excellent. Then we'll begin making preparations immediately. They spent the next hour discussing curriculum schedules and resources needed for the program. As they talked, Isabella found herself increasingly impressed by Alexander's knowledge and insight. He understood music not just as an academic subject, but as a living, breathing art form that could transform lives. When they finally concluded their meeting, the sun was setting, painting the office in shades of gold and amber. Alexander walked her to the door, their fingers brushing briefly as he handed her the proposal documents he'd prepared. "Miss Morrison," he said as she prepared to leave. "Isabella." Her name on his lips sent a thrill through her that she tried desperately to suppress. "Yes. Thank you for giving me a reason to hope that music might return to my life, even if only in small ways." The quiet vulnerability in his voice caught her off guard. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his hand where it rested on the doorframe. "Music never truly leaves us," she said softly. "Sometimes it just waits for the right moment to return." For a heartbeat, they stood frozen in that position, her small hand covering in his larger one, their faces close enough that she could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes. Then Alexander cleared his throat and stepped back, the spell broken. "Good evening, Isabella," he said formally. "Good evening, Alexander," she replied, her voice barely more than a whisper. As she walked home through the gathering dusk, Isabella's mind whirled with possibilities. The music program would change everything. For her, for the children, for the entire school. But it was the memory of Alexander's touch, the way he'd said her name, that made her heart race and her cheeks flush with warmth. She was walking a dangerous path, she knew. Alexander Sterling was her superior, a man of education and refinement who moved in circles far above her own. Any feelings she might develop for him were not only inappropriate, but potentially disastrous for her career. But as she climbed the steps to the small tenement apartment she shared with her mother, Isabella couldn't quite bring herself to regret the afternoon she'd spent in his company. For the first time in years, she felt truly alive, filled with purpose and possibility. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same courage that had carried her through 3 years of teaching. And if fate was kind, perhaps she would find a way to bring music back into the lives of the children she loved. And maybe, just maybe, into her own life as well. The sound of her mother's coughing from the bedroom reminded her of the responsibilities waiting at home, but even that couldn't entirely dim the glow of hope that had taken root in her heart. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new possibilities, and new moments in Alexander Sterling's compelling presence. She could hardly wait. 3 weeks had passed since Alexander's proposal for the music program, and Isabella found herself living in a state of constant anticipation. The school board had approved the initiative with surprising enthusiasm, and preparations were underway to begin formal music instruction after the Christmas holiday. But it was the stolen moments with Alexander that truly set her heart racing. Their meetings had become more frequent, ostensibly to discuss curriculum and lesson plans. Yet Isabella found herself looking forward to these encounters with an intensity that both thrilled and terrified her. There was something magnetic about Alexander Sterling, something that drew her like a moth to flame, despite every rational thought warning her away. This particular evening found them alone in her classroom again, the setting sun casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. Alexander sat at the piano bench, his long fingers moving across the keys with the kind of fluid grace that spoke of years of training. The melody he played was hauntingly beautiful, something she didn't recognize, but that seemed to capture all the longing and regret she sensed hidden beneath his controlled exterior. "That's beautiful," Isabella said softly when the last notes faded away. "I don't know that piece." "It's something I composed years ago," Alexander replied without looking up from the keys. "At the conservatory." Isabella settled onto the bench beside him, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Will you teach it to me?" Alexander turned to look at her, and the intensity in his gray eyes made her breath catch. "It's quite complicated. I'm a quick learner." Something flickered across his face. Amusement, perhaps, or admiration. "Very well. Place your hands like this." He positioned her fingers on the keys, his touch sending electricity shooting up her arms. The contact was innocent enough, but the way he lingered, the gentle pressure of his hands guiding hers, made her pulse race. "The melody begins in the right hand," he murmured, his voice low and close to her ear. "Like this." As Isabella attempted to follow his instruction, she became acutely aware of his proximity. His shoulder brushed against hers as he reached across to demonstrate a particularly difficult passage, and she caught the subtle scent of his cologne mixed with something uniquely him. It was intoxicating, making it difficult to concentrate on the music. "I can't seem to get this transition," she said, her fingers stumbling over the keys. "Here." Alexander's hands covered hers, guiding her through the passage. "Feel the music, don't just think about it. Let it flow through you." Isabella closed her eyes, allowing herself to sink into the sensation of the music moving through her body. Under Alexander's gentle guidance, her fingers found their rhythm, and suddenly the melody emerged pure and sweet in the quiet classroom. "There," Alexander said softly, but he didn't remove his hands from hers. "Perfect." Isabella opened her eyes to find him watching her with an expression that made her heart skip. There was something tender in his gaze, something that suggested he saw her not just as a colleague or even a friend, but as a woman. The realization sent a thrill of awareness through her that she couldn't entirely suppress. "Alexander," she whispered, unsure what she meant to say. Before either of them could speak further, the sound of footsteps in the hallway broke the spell. They sprang apart just as Emma Chen appeared in the doorway, her small face bright with excitement. "Miss Morrison, I heard music and thought—" Emma stopped, taking in the scene before her with the sharp perception of childhood. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt." "You're not interrupting anything," Isabella said quickly, her cheeks burning. "Mr. Sterling was just helping me with a difficult piece." Emma's dark eyes moved between them, and Isabella had the uncomfortable feeling that the child saw far more than she should. "Mama sent me to find you," Emma said finally. "She wanted to thank you for the extra lessons and to invite you for dinner on Sunday." Isabella's heart clenched. Mrs. Chen's invitation was both touching and problematic. It was one thing to give Emma lessons in secret, but quite another to become involved with the family socially. Such relationships could raise questions she wasn't prepared to answer. "That's very kind of your mother," Isabella said carefully, "but I'm not sure it would be appropriate." "I think it sounds like a lovely invitation," Alexander interjected, surprising them both. "Community connections are important for our teachers." Isabella stared at him. Was he giving her permission to continue the lessons? Or was there something else behind his words? "Then you'll come?" Emma asked eagerly. Yes, I suppose I could," Isabella said, still watching Alexander's face for some clue to his thoughts. "Wonderful." Emma clapped her hands together. "And Mr. Sterling, you should come too. Mama makes the best dumplings in Harborview." Isabella's eyes widened in alarm. The thought of sitting down to dinner with Alexander in the intimate setting of the Chen family home was both appealing and terrifying. "Oh, I couldn't impose," Alexander began. "It wouldn't be an imposition," Emma said earnestly. "Mama always makes too much food, and Papa would love to meet the new headmaster. He's been wanting to thank you properly for allowing me to stay in school when so many other places turned us away." Isabella felt her heart contract at the reminder of the discrimination Emma's family faced. When the Chens had arrived in Harborview 5 years ago, most schools had refused to admit Emma simply because of her Chinese heritage. Dr. Campbell had been one of the few administrators willing to look beyond prejudice to see a bright, eager child who deserved an education. "Your father is a wise man," Alexander said quietly, "and I would be honored to meet him. If Miss Morrison has no objection, I would be pleased to accept your mother's invitation." Isabella found herself nodding before she could think better of it. "Of course, Sunday it is." Emma beamed and hurried away to carry the news to her mother, leaving Isabella and Alexander alone once more. The atmosphere in the room felt different now, charged with new possibilities and unspoken questions. "You don't have to come," Isabella said softly. "I know you must have other obligations." "I want to come," Alexander said, his gray eyes meeting hers with startling directness. "Unless you'd prefer I didn't." The question hung between them, weighted with meaning that went far beyond a simple dinner invitation. Isabella knew she should say yes, should put distance between them before these dangerous feelings grew any stronger. But looking into his eyes, seeing the vulnerability there, she found she couldn't. "No," she whispered, "I'd like you to be there." Alexander's smile was soft and genuine, transforming his entire face. Then it settled. Sunday arrived gray and blustery with the promise of winter in the sharp wind that rattled the windows of Isabella's small apartment. She dressed carefully in her best Sunday gown, a deep blue wool dress that brought out the color of her eyes, and pinned her hair in a style that was both elegant and practical. Her mother, despite her illness, had insisted on contributing something to the meal. "It's only proper," Eleanor Morrison had said from her bed, her voice thin but determined. "The Chens are showing kindness, and we must reciprocate." So Isabella carried a basket containing her mother's famous apple preserves and a loaf of fresh bread as she made her way through the narrow streets of Harborview's immigrant district. The Chen family lived in a modest apartment above Mr. Chen's small shop where he sold traditional Chinese medicines and remedies to the growing Asian community. Alexander was waiting for her at the corner, looking devastatingly handsome in a dark suit that emphasized his tall frame. He carried a bouquet of late autumn flowers and a bottle of wine that had probably cost more than Isabella made in a week. "You look beautiful," he said as she approached, his voice warm with admiration. Isabella felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Thank you, and thank you for coming. I know this isn't exactly the sort of social obligation you're accustomed to." "What makes you think that?" Alexander asked as they began walking toward the Chen apartment. Isabella glanced at him sideways. "Your clothes, your manner, the way you carry yourself. You're clearly from a much more refined background than the rest of us." Alexander was quiet for a moment. "You might be surprised by my background, Isabella. Refinement can be learned, but it doesn't always indicate privilege." There was something in his tone that made her look at him more closely, but before she could ask what he meant, they had arrived at their destination. Mrs. Chen opened the door with a smile that lit up her entire face. She was a small, delicate woman who reminded Isabella strongly of Emma, though years of hard work had left their mark in the lines around her eyes and the calluses on her hands. "Miss Morrison, Mr. Sterling. Please come in, come in." The apartment was small but spotlessly clean, filled with the rich aromas of garlic ginger and star anise. Mr. Chen rose from his chair by the window, a slight man with intelligent eyes and work-roughened hands who greeted them with formal politeness that barely concealed his nervousness at entertaining the headmaster. "Mr. Sterling," he said in accented but clear English, "it is an honor to have you in our home. Please sit." As they settled around the small table, Isabella found herself watching the family dynamics with professional interest. Emma helped her mother serve the meal with practiced efficiency, translating between English and Mandarin when her father struggled to find the right words. The love between them was evident in every gesture, every gentle correction, every shared smile. Alexander seemed to sense this as well. He addressed Mr. Chen with respectful attention, asking about his work and showing genuine interest in the man's knowledge of traditional medicine. When Emma shyly played a simple melody on a small wooden flute her grandfather had made, Alexander listened with the same serious attention he might have given a performance at the Vienna Opera House. "Emma tells me you've been giving her music lessons," Mrs. Chen said to Isabella as they ate. "It is very kind of you, but we cannot pay much." "The lessons are my pleasure," Isabella said quickly, acutely aware of Alexander listening to every word. "Emma has real talent. She deserves the chance to develop it." "Music is important," Mr. Chen added solemnly. "In China, we say music is the bridge between earth and heaven. It makes the soul complete." Alexander nodded thoughtfully. "In Vienna, I learned that music transcends all barriers. Language, culture, class. It speaks directly to the human heart." "You have been to Vienna?" Mr. Chen asked with interest. "I studied there for a time," Alexander replied carefully. "At the conservatory." Mrs. Chen's eyes widened. "You are a musician." "Was," Alexander corrected quietly. "I gave it up some years ago." Isabella heard the pain in his voice and longed to reach across the table to comfort him. Instead, she turned the conversation to safer topics, asking about Mrs. Chen's recipes and admiring the delicate embroidery work that decorated their simple furnishings. As the evening progressed, Isabella found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't expected. There was something deeply satisfying about sharing a meal with people who understood struggle and sacrifice, who appreciated simple pleasures because they knew how precious they were. Alexander seemed to feel it too. His usual reserve melted away as he laughed at Mr. Chen's stories and patiently answered Emma's endless questions about school administration. When the meal was finished and they were preparing to leave, Mrs. Chen pulled Isabella aside. "You're Mr. Sterling," she said quietly. "He is a good man. I see how he looks at you, how you look at him. But be careful, child. Sometimes love between different worlds brings more pain than joy." Isabella's cheeks burned. Mrs. Chen, I'm sure you are mistaken. These old eyes see much, Mrs. Chen said gently. Just remember, the heart wants what it wants, but the world is not always kind to those who follow their hearts. As they walked home and through the darkening streets, Isabella found herself thinking about Mrs. Chen's words. Was her growing attraction to Alexander really so obvious? And if so, what did that mean for her carefully ordered life? Thank you for coming tonight, she said as they paused outside her building. It meant a great deal to the Chen family. It meant a great deal to me as well, Alexander replied. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be part of a real family gathering. Something in his voice made Isabella look at him more closely. You don't have family meals. Alexander's expression grew distant. I haven't had a family in the traditional sense for many years. The admission hung between them, heavy with unspoken sorrow. Isabella felt her heart ache for him, this strong, controlled man who seemed so alone in the world. Alexander, she began, but he shook his head. It's late, he said quietly. You should go in. Your mother will be worried. Isabella wanted to press him to understand the shadows she glimpsed behind his careful composure, but something in his manner warned her away. Instead, she nodded and began climbing the steps to her apartment. Isabella, Alexander called softly when she reached the door. She turned back to find him looking up at her, his face illuminated by the gas lamp on the corner. Yes, I'm glad you were there tonight. It made everything easier. The quiet vulnerability in his voice sent warmth spreading through her chest. For me as well, she whispered. They stood looking at each other for a long moment, and Isabella felt the dangerous pull of attraction growing stronger. Then Alexander tipped his hat and walked away into the darkness, leaving her with a racing heart and a head full of questions she wasn't sure she was ready to answer. The following week brought the first real test of their new relationship when Mrs. Victoria Whitmore arrived at the school. Isabella was in the middle of a geography lesson when the click of expensive heels in the hallway announced an unexpected visitor. She looked up to see a woman in an elaborate burgundy dress sweeping into the classroom, her presence immediately commanding the attention of every student. Mrs. Whitmore was perhaps 45 years old, with the kind of refined beauty that spoke of excellent breeding and unlimited resources. Her dark hair was perfectly styled beneath a fashionable hat adorned with ostrich feathers, and her kid leather gloves were undoubtedly worth more than Isabella's entire wardrobe. Children, Isabella said calmly, though her heart was racing with apprehension. Please continue with your reading while I speak with our visitor. Miss Morrison, I presume? Mrs. Whitmore's voice was cultured and cool with the kind of accent that suggested education at expensive finishing schools. I am Mrs. Victoria Whitmore. I serve on the school board and have come to observe your teaching methods. Isabella felt her stomach drop. She'd heard whispers about Mrs. Whitmore, a wealthy widow who wielded considerable influence in Harborview society and was known for her strong opinions about proper conduct. What could have brought such a woman to her humble classroom? Of course, Isabella said with as much composure as she could muster. Please feel free to observe. We're just finishing our study of the Western Territories. Mrs. Whitmore moved through the classroom with the air of a general inspecting troops, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. She paused at Emma Chen's desk, her gaze lingering on the child's neat handwriting and careful drawings. Interesting, she murmured. I wasn't aware we were accepting foreign students. The barely concealed disdain in her voice made Isabella's blood boil, but she forced herself to remain professional. All children in Harborview are welcome at our school, Mrs. Whitmore, regardless of their heritage. How progressive. Mrs. Whitmore's smile was razor sharp. And tell me, Miss Morrison, what other progressive ideas has our new headmaster introduced? There was something dangerous in the woman's tone, something that put Isabella immediately on guard. Mr. Sterling has been very supportive of innovative teaching methods. We're planning to introduce a music program after the new year. A music program? Mrs. Whitmore's eyebrows rose. How delightful. And I suppose you'll be conducting these lessons. That's the current plan, yes. Fascinating. Mrs. Whitmore moved closer, her perfume, something expensive and cloying, filling Isabella's nostrils. Tell me, my dear, how long have you known Mr. Sterling before his appointment here, I mean? Isabella's pulse quickened. There was definitely something predatory in the woman's manner now, like a cat toying with a mouse. I met him when he arrived to take up his position. Why do you ask? Oh, no particular reason. It's just that he and I have known each other for many years, since he was quite young, in fact. Mrs. Whitmore's smile grew wider, showing teeth that were perfectly white and sharp. I knew his father very well indeed. Before Isabella could respond to this cryptic statement, the classroom door opened and Alexander himself appeared. The change in his demeanor when he saw Mrs. Whitmore was immediate and dramatic. His face went pale and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Victoria," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "What an unexpected surprise." "Alexander, darling." Mrs. Whitmore glided toward him with predatory grace. "You look wonderful. A bit thinner than when I last saw you, but the rustic life seems to agree with you." Isabella watched this exchange with growing alarm. There was clearly history between these two, and from Alexander's reaction, it wasn't pleasant history. "I wasn't aware you had business with our school," Alexander said stiffly. "Oh, but I do. As a member of the school board, I have a responsibility to ensure that our educational standards remain appropriate." Mrs. Whitmore's gaze flicked meaningfully toward Isabella. "I've been hearing such interesting things about your new programs." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Perhaps this conversation would be better conducted in my office." "Perhaps it would." Mrs. Whitmore gathered her skirts with theatrical precision. "Miss Morrison, it has been illuminating to meet you. I'm sure we'll be seeing much more of each other in the future." The threat in her words was unmistakable, though Isabella couldn't understand its source. She watched helplessly as Alexander escorted Mrs. Whitmore from the classroom, his face a mask of barely controlled emotion. The children, who had been unnaturally quiet during the exchange, immediately burst into whispered speculation. "Who was that lady?" asked Tommy, his freckled face scrunched with curiosity. "Why did she look at Emma like that?" added Mary, her protective instincts aroused on behalf of her classmate. Isabella struggled to regain her composure. "She was just a visitor from the school board. Now let's return to our lesson, shall we?" But her heart wasn't in the geography lesson, and she found herself glancing toward the door every few minutes, wondering what was happening in Alexander's office. When the final bell rang, she dismissed the children with unusual haste and made her way down the hall. She found Alexander standing at his office window, staring out at the street below, with an expression of such profound weariness that it made her heart ache. "Alexander," she said softly from the doorway. He turned, and she was shocked to see how much older he looked than he had that morning. "Come in, Isabella. Close the door." She did as he asked, moving to stand beside him at the window. "That woman, Mrs. Whitmore, who is she to you?" Alexander was quiet for so long that Isabella thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "She was my father's companion after he left my mother." The words hit Isabella like a physical blow. She thought of Mrs. Whitmore's predatory smile, the way she looked at Alexander with such proprietary satisfaction, and felt sick. "Oh, Alexander," she breathed, "my father was a weak man." Alexander continued, still staring out the window. "Charming, talented, but weak. When his business failed and our family lost everything, he couldn't bear the shame. So he ran away with Victoria Whitmore, who was young and beautiful and rich enough to keep him in the style he felt he deserved." Isabella's heart broke for the young man. He must have been watching his world collapse around him. "How old were you?" 16, "Old enough to take care of my mother and younger sister, or so I thought." Alexander's laugh was bitter. "Mother died 2 years later. Pneumonia brought on by living in a drafty tenement because it was all we could afford. Sarah," his voice broke slightly. "Sarah died of scarlet fever the year after that. She was only 14. Isabella felt tears spring to her eyes. "I'm so sorry. I worked my way through school, earned a scholarship to Vienna. I thought I could make something of myself, become the musician my father had always wanted to be, but never had the discipline for. And for a while it seemed possible. Until Victoria found me." "Found you?" Alexander turned from the window, his gray eyes dark with old pain. "She'd married someone else by then, a wealthy businessman who conveniently died and left her everything. She offered to sponsor my education to set me up in a career. All I had to do was—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Isabella didn't need him to. The implication was clear enough, and it made her stomach turn. "You refused." "Of course I refused, but she made it clear that my refusal would have consequences. Suddenly my scholarship was revoked. My professors turned cold, opportunities dried up. I had to leave Vienna and find work wherever I could. Isabella felt a surge of fierce protectiveness toward this man who had suffered so much. And now she's here. Now she's here, Alexander confirmed grimly, which means she wants something, a shemeting. The question is what? As if in answer to his words, there was a sharp knock at the office door. Alexander's secretary, Mr. Hartwell, appeared with an envelope bearing the official seal of the school board. "This just arrived for you, sir," he said, his face grave. The messenger said it required immediate attention. Alexander tore open the envelope and read the contents, his face growing paler with each line. When he finished, he sank into his chair as if the strength had gone out of his legs. "What is it?" Isabella asked, though she was afraid she already knew. "A formal complaint has been filed against both of us," Alexander said quietly, "alleging improper conduct in violation of professional standards. The board is calling for an immediate investigation." Isabella felt the blood drain from her face. "Mrs. Whitmore." "Mrs. Whitmore," Alexander confirmed. "She's not just here to observe Isabella. She's here to destroy us both." The week following Mrs. Whitmore's complaint passed in a haze of whispered conversations and worried glances. Isabella threw herself into her teaching with desperate intensity, as if perfect lesson plans and flawlessly organized classrooms could somehow shield her from the storm that was gathering. But she could feel the weight of scrutiny from parents, colleagues, and school board members who had suddenly developed an intense interest in her every move. Alexander had become a ghost in the hallways, appearing only when absolutely necessary for school business. When their paths did cross, he maintained such rigid formality that Isabella's heart ached. She understood his reasoning. Any appearance of impropriety now could be disastrous for them both, but the distance between them felt like a physical wound. It was Emma Chen who brought the first ray of hope into the darkness. "Miss Morrison," the child said one afternoon as Isabella packed up her teaching materials, "my father would like to speak with you. He says it's important." Isabella looked up from her papers, surprised. "Is everything all right at home?" Emma nodded gravely. "Papa says the bad lady came to our shop. She asked questions about you and Mr. Sterling. Papa didn't like her questions." Isabella's blood ran cold. If Mrs. Whitmore was interrogating the families of her students, the woman's reach was even more extensive than she'd feared. "What kind of questions?" Isabella asked carefully. "About the dinner we had, about whether you and Mr. Sterling acted improper." Emma's young face scrunched with confusion at the adult concept. "Papa told her that you were both very respectful and kind, but she kept asking more questions, offering him money to change his story." Isabella sank into her chair, overwhelmed by the implications. Mrs. Whitmore wasn't just filing complaints. She was actively trying to manufacture evidence against them. "Emma, this is very important," Isabella said gently. "Did your father take the money?" Emma's chin lifted with pride. "Papa said our honor is not for sale. He told the bad lady to leave our shop and never return." Relief flooded through Isabella, followed immediately by guilt. The Chen family could ill afford to turn down money, especially with winter approaching and medical bills mounting for Mr. Chen's recent injury at the docks. "Your father is a good man," Isabella said softly. "He wants to help you and Mr. Sterling." Emma continued, "He says Mrs. Whitmore is trying to hurt good people, and that is wrong. Papa has written a letter to the school board about her visit. He asked other families to write letters too." Isabella felt tears spring to her eyes. The idea that the immigrant families she'd worked so hard to support were now rallying to protect her was both humbling and heartbreaking. "Emma, you must thank your father for me, but you must also tell him to be careful. Mrs. Whitmore is a powerful woman, and she could make things difficult for your family." Emma nodded solemnly. "Papa understands, but he says some things are more important than being safe." That evening, Isabella made her way to her mother's bedside with a heavy heart. Eleanor Morrison had been declining steadily over the past month, her breathing growing more labored and her strength fading with each passing day. Dr. Wright had gently warned Isabella that the end was likely near, and she'd been spending every free moment at her mother's side. "You look troubled, my dear," Eleanor said softly as Isabella settled into the chair beside the bed. Despite her illness, her mother's eyes remained sharp and knowing. Isabella hesitated. She tried to shield her mother from the scandal brewing at school, not wanting to add to her worries. But Eleanor had always been able to read her daughter's moods with uncanny accuracy. "There's been some Difficulty at school, Isabella admitted finally, involving the handsome new headmaster, I assume. Eleanor's voice held a trace of amusement despite her weakness. Isabella's cheeks flushed. How did you? My dear child, you've been walking around with stars in your eyes for weeks. And when you speak of him, your voice gets soft and dreamy in a way it never has before. Eleanor reached out with a trembling hand to touch Isabella's cheek. Tell me about him. So Isabella did. She told her mother about Alexander's kindness to the students, his passion for education, his tragic past, and the growing feelings between them that seemed to deepen with each passing day. She spoke of Mrs. Whitmore's vendetta and the investigation that threatened to destroy everything they'd built. When she finished, Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Love is a rare and precious gift, Isabella. When it comes into your life, you must fight for it with everything you have. But mother, the scandal, the investigation, will pass, Eleanor said firmly. But love like this, love that makes you glow with happiness, that brings out the best in both of you, that is worth any amount of temporary difficulty. Isabella felt tears sliding down her cheeks. I'm so scared. What if I lose my position? What if Alexander's career is ruined because of me? Then you'll find another way, Eleanor said simply. Love has a way of opening doors we never knew existed. Trust in that, my darling. Trust in him. As if summoned by their conversation, a soft knock came at the apartment door. Isabella wiped her eyes and went to answer. It's surprised to find Alexander standing in the hallway with his hat in his hands and an expression of profound determination on his face. Alexander, what are you doing here? I needed to see you, he said quietly. May I come in? Isabella glanced back toward her mother's room, then nodded and stepped aside. Alexander followed her into the small sitting room, his presence seeming to fill the modest space. How is your mother? He asked gently. Failing? Isabella admitted, her voice thick with emotion. Dr. Wright says it won't be much longer. Alexander's face softened with sympathy. I'm sorry, I know how much she means to you. They stood in awkward silence for a moment, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them. Finally, Alexander spoke. Isabella, I need you to know something. Whatever happens with the investigation, whatever Ms. Whitmore does, none of this is your fault. Of course it's my fault, Isabella said fiercely. If I hadn't been so forward, if I'd maintained proper distance. Stop. Alexander stepped closer, his gray eyes intense. You've done nothing wrong. Victoria's vendetta is against me, not you. You're simply caught in the crossfire of a war that began long before we met. But why, Isabella asked desperately. What does she hope to gain by destroying us? Alexander was quiet for a moment, struggling with some internal battle. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with old pain. Because I'm the one thing she could never possess completely. My father's love for her was born of weakness and desperation, but she knew he never stopped regretting the family he'd abandoned. She spent years trying to erase that guilt by controlling every aspect of his son's life. Isabella felt a chill run down her spine. She wants to control you. She wants to own me, Alexander corrected. And seeing me happy, seeing me building something meaningful with someone else, it's unbearable to her. The implications of his words hit Isabella like a physical blow. You're saying she'll never stop, that she'll keep coming after us no matter what we do. Unless we give her what she wants, Alexander said quietly. Isabella stared at him, afraid to ask what that might be. But she didn't need to. She could see the answer in his eyes and the defeated set of his shoulders. You're thinking of resigning, she whispered. It would protect you, Alexander said simply. With me gone, she'd have no reason to pursue the investigation. You could keep your position, continue teaching the children who need you. And what about the music program? What about everything we've planned? It would continue without me. You're more than capable of running it on your own. Isabella felt anger flare in her chest, hot and fierce. I don't want to run it without you. I don't want any of this without you. The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest and completely inappropriate for an unmarried woman to say to her employer. But Isabella was past caring about propriety. Alexander closed his eyes as if her words caused him physical pain. Isabella, you don't understand what you're saying. A life with me would mean constant struggle, constant scrutiny. You deserve so much more than... I deserve to choose for myself, Isabella interrupted fiercely. And I choose you, Alexander Sterling. I choose you with all your complicated past and uncertain future. I choose you because you make me laugh and challenge me to be better and see magic in the simplest moments. Alexander opened his eyes and Isabella was stunned to see tears shimmering in their gray depths. You can't possibly mean that. I've never meant anything more in my life. For a heartbeat, they stood frozen, staring at each other across the small room. Then Alexander crossed the distance between them in two swift strides and pulled her into his arms, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that was desperate and tender and full of all the words they'd been afraid to say. Isabella melted into his embrace, her hands fisting in the fabric of his coat as she kissed him back with all the passion she'd been holding in check for weeks. This was what she'd been dreaming of, what her heart had been yearning for, the feeling of being cherished and desired and completely understood. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he whispered, the words barely audible. God help me, Isabella, I love you beyond all reason. I love you too, she whispered back, her heart soaring with joy despite everything else that threatened them. From the bedroom came the sound of gentle applause, and they sprang apart to find Eleanor Morrison standing in the doorway, leaning heavily on the frame, but smiling with more warmth than Isabella had seen from her in months. It's about time, her mother said weakly. I was beginning to think you two would dance around each other forever. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Isabella arrived at school to find Alexander waiting for her in the classroom, his face bright with excitement in something that looked remarkably like hope. Samuel Harrison is here, he said without preamble. Isabella blinked, confused. I'm sorry, who? The investigator the school board sent. Samuel Harrison? Isabella, he was my father's closest friend before everything fell apart. He's the one who helped me get my first teaching position after I left Vienna. Isabella felt her heart skip. Do you think that's good or bad? I think, Alexander said carefully, that Victoria may have overplayed her hand this time. An hour later, Isabella found herself sitting in Alexander's office, across from a distinguished gentleman with kind eyes and silver hair. Samuel Harrison had the bearing of a man accustomed to authority, but there was warmth in his manner that immediately put her at ease. Miss Morrison, he said gently, I want you to know that I've spent considerable time reviewing the complaint against you and Mr. Sterling, as well as speaking with members of your school community. The picture that emerges is quite different from what Mrs. Whitmore has alleged. Isabella felt a flutter of hope, but forced herself to remain cautious. In what way, sir? The families I've spoken with paint a picture of two dedicated educators who have brought new life and enthusiasm to the school. The Chen family in particular had very interesting things to say about Mrs. Whitmore's recent visit to their shop. Isabella's pulse quickened. They told you about the money she offered. Among other things. Mr. Harrison's expression grew stern. Attempting to suborn witnesses is a serious matter, Miss Morrison, as is filing false complaints with the intent to damage someone's reputation. False complaints, Alexander leaned forward in his chair. Completely fabricated, Mr. Harrison confirmed. I've found no evidence whatsoever of improper conduct between you. Quite the contrary. Every witness I've spoken with describes interactions that were professional, appropriate, and beneficial to the students. Isabella felt tears of relief spring to her eyes. Then we're cleared. You're cleared, Mr. Harrison said firmly. In fact, the board is so impressed with the work you've both done here that they're considering expanding the music program to include other schools in the district. Alexander reached across the space between their chairs and took Isabella's hand, no longer caring about appearances. And Mrs. Whitmore, Mr. Harrison's expression grew cold. Mrs. Whitmore will be removed from the school board effective immediately. I've also advised her that any further harassment of school personnel will result in legal action. Isabella sagged with relief, finally allowing herself to believe that the nightmare was truly over. But Alexander's next question reminded her that some shadows still lingered. Samuel, I need to ask, why didn't you tell me you were the investigator when the board first contacted you? The older man smiled sadly. Because I needed to be sure, Alexander. Victoria is a persuasive woman, and I've seen her destroy good people before. I couldn't let my friendship with your father influence my judgment. I needed to see for myself what kind of man you'd become. And Alexander's voice was carefully neutral. "You're twice the man your father ever was," Samuel said firmly. "He would be proud of you, and he would be proud of the woman you've chosen to love." Alexander's hand tightened on Isabella's, and she felt her heart overflow with happiness. They'd survived the storm, emerged stronger and more committed to each other than ever. But it was Dr. Wright's arrival an hour later that brought the most unexpected twist of all. "Miss Morrison," the doctor said gently, "I need to speak with you about your mother's condition." Isabella's heart clenched with fear. "Is she—" "She's resting comfortably," Dr. Wright assured her quickly. "But there's something else, something I should have told you weeks ago, but your mother made me promise to wait until after your 27th birthday." Isabella stared at him in confusion. "I don't understand." Dr. Wright reached into his medical bag and withdrew a sealed envelope. "Your father left instructions in his will. There was a trust fund, Isabella. Money he'd saved and invested before his death. It's been earning interest for over 10 years, waiting for you to come of age." Isabella's hands trembled as she took the envelope. "How much money?" "Enough to ensure your mother receives the best medical care available. Enough to secure your future, whatever path you choose to take." Isabella opened the envelope with shaking fingers, scanning the legal documents inside. The sum listed made her gasp. It was more money than she'd ever dreamed of having, enough to transform her life completely. "But why didn't Mother tell me?" she whispered. "Because she wanted you to choose your own path," Dr. Wright said gently. "She was afraid that if you knew about the money, you'd make decisions based on security rather than love. She wanted you to follow your heart first." Isabella looked up at Alexander, who was watching her with an expression of wonder and joy. "My heart has already led me where I need to be," she said softly. 3 months later, on a brilliant spring morning, Isabella Morrison became Isabella Sterling in a simple ceremony at St. Mary's Church. Emma Chen played violin as Isabella walked down the aisle in her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered to fit her smaller frame. Eleanor Morrison had lived to see her daughter's wedding day, passing peacefully in her sleep just 2 weeks later, with a smile on her face and her hand clasped in Isabella's. It was a grief made bearable by the knowledge that her mother had seen her settled and happy, surrounded by love and filled with purpose. The music program at Harbor View Elementary had grown beyond their wildest dreams. With the trust fund money, Isabella had been able to purchase instruments for students who couldn't afford them, and several other schools had requested similar programs. Emma Chen had been accepted to a prestigious music academy in Boston, her tuition paid by an anonymous benefactor who looked remarkably like a certain former headmaster. Alexander had used his connections to establish a scholarship fund for immigrant children, ensuring that students like Emma would never again face barriers to education based on their heritage. The fund was administered jointly by him and Isabella, a partnership that extended far beyond their marriage into every aspect of their shared life. As they stood together in their small cottage by the harbor, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold, and Rose, Isabella reflected on the journey that had brought them here. It hadn't been easy. Love never was. But it had been worth every moment of struggle and uncertainty. "What are you thinking about?" Alexander asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind as they stood at their kitchen window. "Everything," Isabella replied, leaning back against his chest. "How we found each other, how close we came to losing each other, how perfect this all feels now." "Do you ever regret leaving teaching?" Alexander asked softly. Isabella turned in his arms, looking up into the face she'd come to love more with each passing day. "How can I regret it when I'm doing exactly what I was meant to do? We're still teaching, Alexander. We're just doing it differently now." And it was true. Together they were building something larger than either could have accomplished alone. A legacy of music and education that would touch countless lives for generations to come. As if to prove her point, the sound of children's laughter drifted through the open window from the neighborhood school where Isabella now taught advanced music classes 3 days a week. Alexander had taken a position with the state education department, working to establish music programs throughout Massachusetts. "I love you, Mrs. Sterling," Alexander murmured against her hair. "I love you too, Mr. Sterling," Isabella replied, then pulled back to grin at him. "Now come help me with these lesson plans. Tomorrow's students won't teach themselves." They settled together at the kitchen table, working side by side as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Outside, the harbor waves whispered their eternal song, but inside their little cottage, two hearts beat in perfect harmony, creating a music all their own. It was a melody that would last a lifetime. Epilogue. 5 years later, the Harborview Music Academy stood proudly on the hill overlooking the harbor, its red brick facade and tall windows echoing the design of the elementary school where it all began. Isabella Sterling, now the Academy's director, stood in the main concert hall, watching her students prepare for their spring recital. At the piano, a teenage Emma Chen played with the skill and passion that had earned her a full scholarship to the conservatory. In the front row, her parents beamed with pride, Mr. Chen's work-roughened hands folded carefully in his lap as he listened to his daughter create magic from ivory and wood. Alexander entered from the side door, carrying their 2-year-old son on his shoulders. Little Thomas Sterling had his father's gray eyes and his mother's musical ear, and already showed signs of the same passionate temperament that had brought his parents together. "How did the meeting with the Boston School Committee go?" Isabella asked as Alexander set their son down to toddle among the empty chairs. "They want to expand the program to 10 more schools," Alexander said, his face bright with excitement. "And they're offering you the position of district music coordinator." Isabella felt her heart leap. It was an opportunity beyond her wildest dreams. The chance to bring music education to hundreds of children who might otherwise never experience its transformative power. "What do you think?" she asked. Alexander's answer was to sweep her into his arms and spin her around, both of them laughing, as Thomas clapped his chubby hands in delight. "I think," Alexander said as he set her down, "that music has a way of opening doors we never knew existed." Isabella smiled, remembering her mother's words from so many years ago. Eleanor Morrison had been right about many things, but she'd been especially right about love, having a way of opening unexpected doors. As Emma's recital piece swelled to its climactic finale, Isabella felt the familiar sense of wonder that music always brought to her life. But now it was magnified by the love she shared with Alexander, by the joy of watching their students discover their own musical voices, by the promise of all the doors yet to be opened. The last notes faded into silence, followed by thunderous applause. Emma rose from the piano bench, her face glowing with accomplishment, and curtsied to her audience. In that moment, Isabella saw herself at that age, young, passionate, full of dreams that seemed impossible. But nothing was impossible when you had love music and the courage to follow your own heart. As the audience began to file out, chattering excitedly about the performance, Alexander took Isabella's hand and led her to the piano. Without a word, he began to play the melody he'd composed so many years ago in Vienna, the piece that had brought them together in a schoolroom illuminated by lamplight and hope. Isabella joined him, her fingers finding their familiar harmony on the keys. Around them, the concert hall filled with the music of their shared love story, a melody that had begun with secret lessons and stolen moments and had grown into something beautiful and enduring and true. Their son toddled over and leaned against Isabella's knee, his gray eyes wide with wonder at the sounds his parents were creating. In that moment, surrounded by music and love and infinite possibility, Isabella knew that every struggle had been worth it. This was what happiness looked like. Not perfect, not without challenges, but complete in ways she'd never thought possible. As the final notes faded away, Alexander turned to her with the same look of love and admiration that had taken her breath away in a dusty classroom all those years ago. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Sterling?" he asked softly. Isabella looked around the concert hall where tomorrow new students would come to discover the magic of music, where dreams would take root and flourish. Then she looked at her husband and son, her heart overflowing with gratitude for the unexpected turns that had led her to this moment. "I am home," she said simply, and it was true. Home wasn't a place. It was wherever love and music and family existed together in perfect harmony. Hand in hand with their son between them, the Sterlings walked out into the evening light, carrying with them the music that had brought them together and would sustain them for all the years to come. The end.